Hey guys, welcome back to 4th grade social studies. So today we're starting on page 186. We're going to continue on with our lessons on the Great War or World War I. And I wanted to talk about why they called it the Great War instead of World War I. So if you were living in 1914 and you were a soldier, or you were anyone really living at this time, you probably wouldn't know that World War II is coming, or you wouldn't think that you would have another war where almost all the countries in the world were getting involved, right? So they wouldn't call it World War I because they had no idea that World War II was eventually coming 20 years later. All right, so they called it the Great War because it was the biggest war really anyone had been involved with up to that point. So it's the Great War instead of World War I currently. Okay? So read along with me as I read aloud on page 186. So let's first look at that picture. Our caption under that picture says, French soldiers leaving Paris, France. So those soldiers are leaving Paris, France. And why are they leaving Paris? They are going to fight because they're soldiers. That's what soldiers do, right? So let's see, why are they leaving France? So the war in Europe, into the trenches. All over Europe, excitement about the war ran high. Young men stood in long lines to join their nation's army or navy. Crowds flocked to train stations to see soldiers off to the war. Bands played and people sang patriotic songs at the top of their voices. Most people thought the war would be over in a few months. They expected their men to be home by Christmas or even before the leaves had fallen. The hope of a short war soon faded. In the first few battles of the war, thousands of soldiers were killed. The German army hoped to take the French capital city, Paris, but they did not succeed. The French and the British drove them back at the Marne River. After the opening battles, the two sides settled into trenches along the Western Front in France. The war had reached a stalemate, so neither side was gaining any ground. Neither side could gain much ground, as I just said. In the east, the Russian army suffered a terrible defeat by the Germans, but they seized some territory in Austria-Hungary and held on. The trenches on the Western Front became the soldiers' home for most of the war. Life in a trench was very unpleasant. So if you'll look at the black and white picture on page 187, our caption says German trenches on the river in France. So you'll see that it's kind of dug down and they could just see over just with their heads because they did not want to go over the trenches because just on the other side of that trench is going to be their enemies, right? So they're kind of hiding almost underground, just hidden just in the ground, and they could shoot over that at their enemies. All right, so those are the trenches. The trenches were only about 6.5 feet deep and a few feet wide. Rain kept the floor of a trench muddy nearly all the time. Rats and insects were problems. Exploding shells kept the men awake at night. Between enemy trenches was an area called No Man's Land. Tangles of barbed wire made this area difficult to cross. Soldiers took turns manning the front lines of the trenches. When not on frontline duty, they would crawl into trenches farther back to support the front line or to rest. All right, so let's look at that Western Front. So that tells us where the armies are during this time. All right, so the dark green is Germany. And then we have a lighter orange, which says German occupation. And that would be where Germany has taken over. So their soldiers were now in control of Belgium. All right. Then we have neutral countries, which are not involved in the war at all, which is the Netherlands right now. Then we have the Allies, and the Allies are in green. Then we have the trenches, which is like, it looks like kind of like a little railroad track. And then we have no man's land, which is in between those railroad tracks that nobody wanted to cross because there was barbed wire and there were your enemies on the other side of no man's land. They risked their lives this entire time, but definitely when they went up out of the trenches into no man's land and tried to gain ground on enemy territory, it was very, very dangerous. Okay? So, let's continue. By Christmas, soldiers on both sides of the war were worn out. They had planned to be home with their families for the holiday. Now they realized the war was going to last much longer. On the Western Front, soldiers began singing Christmas carols in their trenches on Christmas Eve. To their surprise, they heard the enemy soldiers in the opposite trenches singing along with them. All along the front, the singing went on. On Christmas morning, few men felt like fighting with men that had just sung with them the night before. In many parts of the front, the men declared truces with each other. They agreed to stop fighting just for that one day. German, British, and French soldiers climbed out of their trenches and they walked into no man's land. They walked into no man's land and they shook hands cautiously, very carefully. Because after all, these people are the people that had just been shooting at them just the day before, right? They smiled and wished each other a Merry Christmas. Some shared tins of food, candy, or coffee, and it was a day of peace. Officers quickly put a stop to Christmas truces. Truces made it difficult for the men to start fighting again after you just made these new friends, right? Enemy soldiers could not really trust one another. It was dangerous to try to make friends. After the spring of 1915, there were no more truces. No more making friends. All right, let's look at these new weapons on this next page. New weapons. The style of fighting in World War I was new and different from any earlier wars. Machine guns were better and more powerful than the earlier models. The guns used in World War I could fire more than 600 rounds a minute, so 600 bullets a minute. That's a lot of firepower. If a soldier even raised his head above the top of a trench, he might be blasted with an enemy machine gun. So that's why they were at least 6 feet deep, right? So they could keep their heads down. Armies began using tanks, moving vehicles that could fire shells as they went along. Because of their heavy armor, tanks were very hard to stop. Later in the war, they were big enough to drive across the trenches. So let's stop there for a moment and let's look at that picture. So that is a picture of one of the first tanks ever used. It says armored tanks were first used in World War I. All right, so when we think of tanks, we probably think of a lot bigger tanks that can hold several people in them, right? But you can see that man next to that tank, and it's kind of small. But that was the first model, right? We've improved since then, and they're a lot bigger, a lot stronger. But this was just the first model. All right, let's continue. Chemical weapons were also first used in this war. Poisonous gases were placed inside shells, and when the shells exploded, the gas was released into the air. The gas was difficult to breathe. Sometimes it made soldiers ill, blinded them, or even killed them. Gas masks were invented to help protect soldiers from poisonous gas. So let's look at the picture next to that one. It says gas masks were worn to protect the soldiers from poisonous gas. And if you'll see, that man is walking a dog that also has a gas mask on. All right, so they're protecting the dog too. All right, it says aircraft were also used in warfare for the first time. The Germans used Zeppelins, similar to blimps, to drop bombs. Later in the war, airplanes replaced these slower machines, and fighter planes were light and fast and could carry machine guns. All right, so you can see right there in that picture a Zeppelin in the air. It looks like a blimp that we have now, right? And then below that, you can see Navy ships that were also a part of this war. All right, so we'll stop there for today, and I'll see you guys later.